Hi, welcome back. I'm excited that we're talking today about Ireland, which is, as I've told you, my area of specialization. So I hope you enjoy today's short lecture. Most Irish historians and scholars, myself included, argue that Ireland was, particularly from 1801 to 1922, a colony of Britain. Some also argue that Scotland and possibly Wales are also colonies of England, but in terms of economic and social status within the larger United Kingdom, Scotland and Wales both enjoyed far more equitable relationships with England than Ireland, or indeed any of its other colonies did. Ireland has more in common with Poland, which built its national identity around a strict Catholicism in opposition to communism and Russia's Soviet imperialism, than it does with even Scotland or Wales. Within our conversation about 20th century Europe, then, Ireland falls in the minority of states that was subjugated by another European country. And the key distinction between Ireland and, say, Nigeria or India is that while they were all colonies of Britain, European colonies of other European states were treated differently than African or Asian colonies of European states. For example, while Catholicism was denigrated by English Protestants for its apparent loyalty to the Pope over the English king, the fact remained that Catholicism is still Christianity, and so Irish and English people shared the same basic worldview. And that was not true for the Hindus of India, or the Buddhists of Malaysia, or the polytheists of Nigeria, right? The peoples of those places, if they wanted to find a powerful position within the colonial state, had to change their worldview to a Christian one. And this is just one example, and it doesn't really capture the nuances of this issue. But I just want to be clear from the outset that when I talk about Ireland as a colony, which meant that Irish people experienced all kinds of discriminations and violences that are associated with being a subjugated people, and there are common experiences across imperialisms, there are, of course, also differences. Anyway, moving on. For the first 500 years of on again, off again English rule of Ireland, about the 13th century to the 18th century, Ireland had its own parliament to deal with its domestic issues, even when it was otherwise ruled by the English king or queen. In 1798, though, a group of Irish revolutionaries wanted more autonomy and more democracy in the style of the sort of French revolutionaries, and they too revolted. The English crown crushed that rebellion and then decided that the Irish were too violent and crazy to have their own parliament anymore, so they created the 1801 Act of Union, which dissolved the Irish parliament and created the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. After that, select Irish Protestants, who represented the Protestant minority of Ireland, could serve in the United Kingdom Parliament, which was in London. The 19th century was then a fight to first improve conditions for Catholics, who were harshly discriminated against in the UK generally and were the majority population of Ireland, and then also to repeal the Act of Union and to give Ireland back its own parliament. The repeal movement was replaced in the 1860s by a home rule movement, which was also a political movement, sometimes supported by secret societies prone to violence, like the Landleaguers, who were all agitating for reinstating the Irish Parliament so that Ireland could again oversee its own domestic affairs, but let the Queen continue to handle the foreign affairs. And this was the popular political position in Ireland until about 1900. The Home Rule movement's sort of star leader, Charles Stewart Parnell, died in the 1890s, and after that, things lost their mojo. But after 3 attempted and failed Home Rule bills, one finally passed in 1914. This would have given the Irish their home rule, although this plan was heavily contested by those loyal to the United Kingdom who were living up in the north of Ireland, who didn't want any kind of home rule. They just wanted to be part of the United Kingdom. 1914, however, was a bad year for this to finally happen. As we've discussed previously, and as you already know, 1914 was the year that World War I broke out, and the British could not direct the resources needed to facilitate home rule, which would include sending military troops to deal with the angry Northern Irish loyalists. So they told the Irish parliamentarians that it would have to wait till the war was over. And this seemed okay to the parliamentarians at first, because everyone in Britain, in Ireland, in Europe, everyone thought the war would be a quick one. And obviously, they were wrong. So I mentioned last week in the World Wars overview that some impatient young Irish rebels who decided that home rule was never going to happen and that even if it did, it wasn't going to be enough, they used the distraction of the war to launch a rebellion in 1916. They failed, and most of their leaders were executed. Roger Casement was an internationally recognized humanitarian who spent his career in the British Foreign Service investigating and exposing the abuses of imperialism, particularly in Brazil and the Congo, but then he retired, and the anti-imperialist cause that he took up was Irish independence. He was himself an Irishman. He was caught off the coast of Ireland on his way home from Germany, where he'd tried to convince the German military to give them guns for the planned Easter Rising. He was then thrown in prison, but not before trying to call off the entire rebellion because they simply didn't have the guns, the support that he had sought when he was in Germany. Patrick Pearse, who was a school teacher and a not very good poet, and the Countess Constance Markievicz and a handful of others decided to go forward with the plan anyway, marching into the General Post Office in Dublin and trying to take the city with guerrilla warfare. This is the Countess here on the right. When the rebels ultimately surrendered, because they had no hope of winning, it was a very unorganized and doomed from the start rebellion, 15 of its leaders were executed. Only some of the very youngest, and the women, like Markievicz, were spared. When his friends implored the British government to release Roger Casement, they leaked his personal diaries, which recorded his daily activities, as many men of the time did. They would just sort of write down their daily transactions, what they did, just as a sort of record of their everyday life. But his diaries in particular included his sexual relationships with men in all the places he visited. And after the release of his diaries, no one came to Casement's defense, and he was hanged with the rest, which is, a whole other conversation about homophobia and in Irish Catholic nationalism in the 20th century that we don't have time for today, but if you're interested, we can always talk about it sort of off book. So the 15 who were killed were mostly young men in their early 20s. And even though it was within the bounds of reason to kill them, after all, they'd committed treason in a time of war, it outraged the majority of Irish citizens. Those who'd been opposed to violence, who'd been opposed to the Easter Rising when it happened, and who'd been content to wait for the Home Rule to take effect after the war, they hopped the fence. In 1918, when the thousands of Irish men and women who'd volunteered for the British war effort returned home, the political climate in Ireland had changed dramatically. In part, this was facilitated by women's suffrage in 1918. All women of the UK were endowed with the right to vote. In the elections that year, almost all of the Irish parliamentary seats went to a new radical party, the Sinn Féin, which is Irish for ourselves alone. I guess I should put that in here, huh? Sinn Féin. The Sinn Féiners refused to take their seats in the British Parliament and instead established, their own. I lost my place. And instead established their own government in Ireland. Among those elected were the 1916 war hero Constance Markievicz, though she was one of only 2 women elected that year, as there was a lot of confusion about whether women could even stand for parliament as well as vote. And then Michael Collins, the man in the middle here, and Eamon de Valera, the man to the left. Collins and de Valera were also both part of the 1916 Rising, but had escaped execution. They weren't quite high enough up on the totem pole yet in their political careers, but they would go on to be the leaders of the War for Independence. So Michael Collins served essentially as the military commander and then launched a guerrilla war against the British military police and then the reinforcements that they sent, the auxiliaries, or the black and tans, as which they were so called because there weren't enough uniforms, so they wore a combination of military, khaki, and police uniform black. And here are a few of the black and tans down here. You can see this guy's got his khaki jacket on. He's wearing black pants. This guy's all in black, and they're sort of mixed. The entire island nation then was thrown into war, and civilians were caught in the middle. British soldiers assumed that civilians were hiding Irish Republican Army soldiers, and the IRA members assumed that any Irish civilian not doing something to support the cause, obviously support the cause, was then collaborating with the British, with the enemy. Both sides committed horrific atrocities against each other and against the civilian population. In the end, though, Michael Collins knew that a sustained war effort was just not possible. The British had more soldiers than the Irish could ever beat back, and the toll the war was taking on the people would leave them more broken than they'd been under British rule. So when the British called for a ceasefire to negotiate a peace, de Valera and Michael Collins agreed. Eamon de Valera sent Collins to lead the treaty brokering delegation. Most scholars believe he did this knowing the outcome, that the British would never agree to total independence because there were too many loyalists still in the northern counties of Ireland, and they just couldn't abandon them. To that end, if the British had permitted total independence, it's most likely that the Northern Irish would have continued fighting and they'd have been wiped out by the IRA. Collins and the other delegates signed a treaty to that effect, one that said that every county in Ireland would be given the right to vote whether it wanted to stay in the UK or if it wanted to join an Irish Free State. When Collins presented the treaty to the Irish Parliament in 1921, war-weary and ready for it all to be over, Eamon de Valera, even though he knew it was coming, said no, because it went against the stated mission of Sinn Féin. But half of the Irish Parliament said yes. The other half, the smaller half, those who'd be dubbed the anti-treatyites thereafter, walked out of Parliament, and within hours civil war had broken out. Eamon de Valera led the anti-treatyites, and Michael Collins led the pro-treatyites. The Civil War was even more brutal than the War for Independence, and families were ripped apart over this treaty issue, which notably, this split between pro-treaty and anti-treaty would actually shape Irish political parties for the next 40 years. Even today, there are still, there's Fianna Fáil, which is the anti-treatyite party, and there was Fine Gael, which was the pro-treaty group that was led by Michael Collins. So the Civil War lasted for 10 months, from the 28th of June 1922 to the 24th of May 1923, and over that 10 months, the two sides went at each other.